Hello and welcome to Greenomics, a podcast from Oxford Economics where we delve into the complex relationships between climate, nature, and our global economy. I'm your host, Sarah Nelson, and the Economics and Sustainability team here at Oxford Economics, and together we'll be navigating the changing landscape of the green transition. Each month, we'll be joined by a panel of experts to discuss one aspect of sustainability and unpack what it means in today's economy. We'll explore how the economy can be harnessed to address the climate crisis and how businesses can help to create a sustainable future for all. Global warming is no longer a distant threat. It's a reality that demands our immediate attention. Shifting climate patterns and extreme weather events pose major threats to individuals, companies, and countries around the world. At the same time, of course, our global economy faces challenges of its own. Managing the many risks and their economic impacts is essential for businesses, but there's also an opportunity to be a leader in the transition to a global green economy. Greenomics will explore the risks and opportunities and distill our leading economic analysis into insights for your business. This month's episode will explore the clean energy transition. Our listeners, of course, will be familiar with the shift from fossil fuel energy sources like coal, oil, and gas to renewable energy like solar and wind. But given the mix of optimistic bluster from politicians and somewhat bleak reports coming out of the IPCC and the like, it's hard to tell what's actually going on. Today, we'll sift through all of that to discuss who is leading the energy transition and which industries stand to gain from a shift to the green economy. To help us navigate these waters, I'm joined by two of the team here at Oxford Economics, James Lambert and Sean Metcalfe. James is Director for Economic Consulting in Asia, based in Singapore, and was the lead author on a major white paper produced recently in collaboration with Arup on the global green economy. Sean is a lead economist on the industries team, where he helps to shape their views on the global industrial outlook and forecast the utility sector. He's also been part of the big drive to include climate in our in-house global industry model, which assesses the energy transition at a sectoral level. I'm actually going to start with definitions because, as I said, there's so many terms flying around out there. So, James, can I start with you? What is the green economy?
Oh, it's a good job I've got a long podcast to fill that question in, Sarah. Obviously, it's kind of a term that means different things to different people, and that's not necessarily a problem. But I think one way of understanding it is that it captures all economic activity or value creation that makes a neutral or net positive impact on the environment, as opposed to economic activity that depletes environmental resources. And I think what we've discovered is, obviously that sounds fine as a concept that people can get underneath, but obviously the devil's in the detail when you start to look into economic statistics and try and find the green economy within there. So you need a detailed taxonomy of all of the activities that might actually be defined as green that meet that criteria.
Interesting, and I understand that was a big part of your project with Arup.
It was, yeah, and there are lots of taxonomies out there people are probably familiar with. But the problem with the ones that exist is that they're often tailored towards more of a green finance bent, an investment in green investment qualification criteria. And that's only partially useful as a tool for green economic policy making. So the purpose of our work was to really try to create a much more detailed and broader taxonomy of green economic activity across the whole economy. And with that, you can really, if you're able to kind of start to observe activity in that way, you can really start to understand change and how the economy is evolving towards a setting in which more and more economic activity is occurring without depleting or damaging the environment.
And on that note, Sean, what is the clean energy transition and how does it relate to the green economy?
Yeah, sure. So, the clean energy transition refers to a process of transforming the way energy is both produced and consumed in order to sort of allow us to move away from energy sources that produce, significant greenhouse emissions and towards energy sources that generate either very little or zero kind of greenhouse gas emissions. And the sort of goal of that is to sort of slow and limit the rate of human-induced global warming. But kind of in practice, to a large degree, what that process involves is what we call decarbonization together with electrification. So it means kind of moving away from fossil fuel-based energy use and towards electricity as a kind of primary energy source while at the same time having to sort of decarbonize the way that we generate electricity as well. So within the electricity sector, we have to have that shift, again, away from fossil fuel-based power generation towards predominantly renewables-based electricity generation, but also in some cases nuclear and also possibly hydrogen to a lesser extent as well.
So tell us a little bit more about how the clean energy transition is going. What sectors are leading as we stand today?
Yeah, sure. So it's fairly widely accepted now that limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees is going to require immediate and steep reductions in emissions across all sectors. But I think like a natural starting point to looking at how the transition is going from a sectoral perspective is to ask, well, which sectors currently produce the most emissions in the present? So if we restrict our attention to CO2 emissions specifically and define sectors in a relatively broad way, the highest emitting sector at the moment is the electricity and heat sector, which accounts for about 40% of global CO2 emissions. Then you have, in second, you have the industrial sector. So that refers to activities like manufacturing, mining and construction. That accounts for about 25% of global CO2 emissions. Then you have the transport sector. The majority of emissions here come from the road vehicle sector, but then you also have aviation, shipping, and to a lesser extent, rail contributing emissions in that category as well. Together, they account for about 20% of global emissions. And then the kind of final major high emitting sector would be the building sector, which accounts for about 8% of global CO2 emissions. Most of those from households, but also commercial buildings as well, things like offices and hotels. So if you kind of take those broad sectors and look at sort of how emissions are evolving in each of them, our kind of in-house view is that none of them are decarbonizing fast enough to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And indeed, our baseline forecast sees average global temperatures reaching 2 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels by 2050. So just kind of to clarify what I mean when I say baseline. So our baseline is our central assessment of what we kind of deem to be the most likely outcome based on current climate policy commitments. But we only factor them into our forecast to the extent that they're backed up by measures that are deemed to be sufficiently detailed and credible from our perspective. So I guess the implication of our baseline forecast for sectoral emissions is that policymakers are kind of failing to take sufficient action across the kind of spectrum of economic activity to reach those climate targets. So if you kind of look at how emissions have evolved, over the last 5 years or so, the only sector where CO2 emissions were actually lower in, say, 2021 than they were in 2015, for example, is the transport sector. And that was kind of to a large degree an artificial kind of result of the fact that economic activity and therefore energy consumption just hadn't fully recovered in the aviation sector. So it didn't really have anything to do with decarbonisation per se. It was kind of more to do with just economic activity failing to have properly recovered post-pandemic. That meant that its emissions were lower. So the kind of conclusion, I suppose, is that across the board, we're not seeing enough decarbonisation taking place to meet climate goals.
So it sounds like they're all hard to decarbonise, but are there any which are particularly hard to decarbonise? What are the options for things like industry, heavy industry?
As you say, some sectors are much tougher to decarbonise than others. Those that are kind of regarded as being among the most difficult to decarbonise, I would say, are the agriculture sector, the aviation sector, shipping, and also certain manufacturing processes, particularly those within heavy industry like the steel sector. Also within the road vehicle sector, heavy goods vehicles are also very challenging to decarbonise as well. But I think a really interesting case is the aviation sector, which is possibly the hardest sector to decarbonise of them all. And that's partly because the world's air transport infrastructure is just so heavily locked into oil. And the key property oil has that makes it very useful for aircraft is that it's the most energy dense fuel. It doesn't occupy too much space in the aircraft. And at present, there's no kind of real meaningful alternative to oil in the market. But however, kind of more recently, we've found that over the course of the next decade or so, improvements in battery technology should enable commercially viable electric aircraft that are kind of capable of making short-haul flights with a small number of passengers. But the issue is that although short-haul flights account for quite a large share of total passenger traffic within the industry, they actually represent a pretty negligible share of the total fuel use within the sector, because most of the fuel use taking place in the sector arises out of the long-haul flights, and electrified long-haul flights just don't look technologically feasible. So our baseline sees electricity powering only about 3% of global aviation energy use by 2050, with the remainder still oil. And so I guess your question originally was, what are the alternatives in these kind of hard to decarbonize sectors? I mean, within the context of the aviation sector, there are a number of other kind of potential paths to decarbonisation. For example, hydrogen, e-fuels, and biofuels are the kind of most commonly cited examples. But our view is that the current policy and kind of technological trajectories of these alternatives don't really give us the confidence to forecast that they're going to play a meaningful role within the industry, over the course of the next, 20, 30 years.
So technology is obviously one way to get to net zero, or to go to clean energy. There's also behavior. Is that somewhere that behavior is just going to have to be the main lever to reduce emissions?
So in the context of the aviation sector, I think behavioral change does have the capacity to help reduce emissions, because of course, anything that serves to reduce the demand for air travel in a meaningful way has the capacity to reduce economic activity in the sector, and therefore, the amount of energy being used, which will then, have a dampening effect on emissions. So avoiding flying or reducing the amount of flying by seeking alternative means of transport where that's feasible, obviously can have the effect of dampening demand. But I think it's very difficult to and uncertain to sort of gauge the extent to which people will voluntarily reduce air travel. I think, people are much more conscious of the environmental impact of aviation today, and it remains an extremely popular form of long distance transport. So I think there's room to be quite skeptical of how significant a factor it will be in reducing aviation emissions in practice.
Thank you, Sean. And that obviously relates a lot more to sort of businesses changing preferences and so on. So James, maybe you could tell us a bit more about this project. How did the people that you spoke to for that project feel about the future of business?
Yes, well, I mean, I think everybody's aware of the type of, relatively scary and dismal projections that Sean's kind of summarized there, and just how difficult this transition is going to be. It's an extremely, working backwards from this 2050 scenario that we're quite comfortable talking about, but there's less understanding about how exactly we get there. When you work backwards from that that vision of a carbon neutral world by 2050, then the types of transitions that have to take place across the global energy system are absolutely kind of daunting, and that's going to be a costly and painful process. We know from our scenario modelling that it's much less costly and painful than not combating climate change, but that's and that's an okay story to tell over a 30-50 year period. But it's very difficult to convince businesses and policymakers as well of the value of that long-term benefit when there's a very serious short-term cost that they're facing right now. And I think what we've been doing, we launched the report at a kind of global level in January, and we've been moving around different countries in the region here to connect with kind of leaders of industry in different economies and testing the findings with them. And I think what obviously there is a conflict between these big global climate scenarios that everyone can get on board with, and then the reality of what kind of converting these scenario assumptions into practical action means on the ground. And in every country that we speak to, that's often the main point of conversation, is kind of drilling down into what this actually means right now and just how costly and unpractical that is. And it's not because there isn't a lack of will. There are businesses that are increasingly hurriedly and more seriously signing up to international accords and trying to do more in terms of making their own enterprises more sustainable. But it's a costly and difficult process, and it's fraught with complexity in terms of these kind of overlapping international systems. So I think businesses in Asia are certainly cognizant of the big risks to their own business model and to their own economic trajectory, not just of climate change and how it will affect them, but of what the world is going to do to mitigate climate change and how that will affect their economic outlook. There is a sense that people are trying to look for the opportunities within that transition, but there's clearly not enough information around at the moment for people to feel they've got a real good grip of that strategic risk.
Yeah, there's a lot of competing factors or complementary factors in some case, but there's certainly a lot going on. Do the businesses that you speak to in Asia, do they feel like they're at risk of being left behind, or do you think Asia is kind of at the forefront of the transition?
I don't think it's at the forefront. I think it's awash with opportunity. Part of our green economy report was to try to, turn around the analysis to say, as the global economy transitions towards this new state, where will the opportunities emerge? And there will be these great big new markets for green goods and services that don't currently exist or are currently niche, and there'll be huge supply chains supporting them, and there'll be all sorts of kind of offshoots from what will need to take place to kind of assume that scenario. A lot of those opportunities will apply to this part of the world, both in a manufacturing sense, both in kind of green financing, exporting carbon credits, finding uses for byproducts for agricultural materials that will feed into circular supply chains in other markets internationally. There's a lot of the opportunities here that's very applicable from what we're finding. But I don't think they're ahead of the curve in terms of being able to seize them. One interesting example is we've been in Malaysia and Indonesia, where there's a very prominent palm oil industry, which has obviously it's got all sorts of reputational and structural problems that are very well publicized, and one of them relates to climate. There's a very kind of relevant historical track record of deforestation that goes in towards fueling kind of palm oil production. Palm oil product actually is integral to all sorts of things that we rely on in daily life, and is actually a very valuable export, and these two markets hold an enormous market share. But increasingly, with the pressures that are coming out of regulations happening in Europe and in North America and in other parts of the world that are more forward-leaning on tackling climate change, they're realizing that there's a major risk to their export revenues from doing that. And in Malaysia, interestingly, some of the firms there were talking about trying to prioritize or identify the opportunity in value over volume of the type of exports of these kind of raw material products in the future. Because within the spirit of what we're talking about in terms of the green transition, creating opportunities, those entities, those enterprises that are able to kind of achieve that sustainable certification, meet the standards required by big European markets under new regulation. There's a huge opportunity there in terms of positioning a company as a low risk supplier in this new context where everybody has to justify every purchase that's made all the way through this, rather than what currently seen as, which is a high risk node in an increasingly scrutinized global value chain. So I think they're recognizing that they can compete on this new playing field in the next era of this climate transition, whereas previously it might have been down to price and obviously things like quality of product.
Interesting. I guess it's about identifying those opportunities and taking them where they can be.
Yes, and they do present themselves very differently on a country-by-country basis. Not every country will be able to seize every massive global green opportunity. Not everybody will become the world's biggest EV manufacturer, but it's about understanding which of those niche opportunities are really relevant to the comparative advantage within your own economy. And I think hopefully that's the kind of analysis and recognition which will actually accelerate the transition, because the more that this can be seen as a commercial opportunity as well as an environmental imperative, one would hope that does accelerate the rate of change.
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting point, James, and I wanted to touch on that a bit more because, well, the speed of the clean energy transition is actually quite close to my heart. It was the subject of my PhD, but I'm a few years out of date now, so I'm really keen to hear what you two have to say on the subject. 2050 really seems like it's only getting closer. I actually just got a mortgage, which ends in 2048, which really brought it home to me. And it seems like we have a lot to do and not a lot of time. So Sean, one for you. What do your forecasts say about the rate of change that's required to get the green energy transition across the line?
Yeah, so I think we can use kind of scenario analysis to help answer that question, because as I mentioned, our kind of baseline forecast is that the world does not really get across the line in achieving carbon neutrality by 2050. But we can sort of use scenario analysis to look at sort of departures from that baseline that can kind of help us assess the sort of range of alternative future pathways, including kind of pathways that allow us to achieve kind of net zero by 2050. That's why we have the Global Climate Service, which essentially, quantifies the macroeconomic impacts of various, climate scenarios against our baseline forecasts. And alongside that, we have our, our Global Industry Climate Service, which then quantifies the sectoral impacts of the same kind of set of climate scenarios. So some of those scenarios that we look at involve modeling a successful transition to net zero by 2050. And so we have like a concrete set of forecasts that are consistent with net zero. And then you can sort of compare that to our baseline to sort of see what it is that is required, or what is missing from the current policy environment to kind of to achieve carbon neutrality. I won't go too sort of deeply into the nuts and bolts of that, because it's very complex and it would take a long time. But I think at the core of where kind of the net zero scenario differs from our baseline, I suppose, is that in our net zero scenario, governments implement very aggressive and sort of globally coordinated carbon pricing policies, as well as kind of technological investment. So I think the sort of two major departures from the baseline are, I guess, in the extent to which carbon pricing is being used, as well as the sort of amount of capital investment that's being allocated to decarbonizing our energy supply. So, for example, currently, globally, only around 23% of total emissions are covered by an explicit kind of carbon pricing instrument. But in our net zero scenario, emissions coverage of carbon policies reaches around 100% by 2025, allowing carbon prices to kind of affect, the full spectrum of economic activity. And what the sort of aggressiveness of that carbon pricing does is it sort of induces a faster adoption of electricity and a faster kind of shift away from fossil fuels in industries like transport and buildings, where there's still a very significant amount of fossil fuel consumption still taking place. But also, the scenarios also acknowledge that there are certain industries where full decarbonization is unrealistic. I took you through the example of aviation, that would be one, which means that the scenarios themselves also kind of assume some availability of carbon capture kind of technologies as well, which means that there are still sort of non-zero emissions in some of those harder to abate sectors, even in a kind of carbon neutral world.
Yeah, it's interesting. There was a big energy crisis last year, and it's ongoing, certainly here in the UK. How has that changed the outlook for our energy transition?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think the energy crisis in some ways is likely to accelerate the transition, because the crisis itself stemmed in a lot of ways from a kind of over-reliance in Europe, especially on kind of imported fossil fuels, specifically kind of Russian imported fossil fuels. And so as one of the many responses to that, European policymakers clearly see a kind of faster transition to renewables as one way of sort of reducing that dependence on fossil fuel imports, but also sort of enhancing energy security, which has become a really important priority for policymakers in view of the crisis as well. Now, of course, part of the response to the crisis was also to very quickly kind of secure alternative sources of fossil fuels as well. So it's not all a kind of renewable story, but I think that the havoc wreaked by high and sort of volatile fossil fuel prices has made the transition to renewables look like a more attractive prospect than, say, before the crisis. And I think one of the other sort of elements of a faster rollout of renewables that I think the crisis kind of makes look more attractive is the fact that in Europe, especially, gas prices, which obviously spiked very considerably last year, they also play a really kind of significant role in setting electricity prices here in Europe. And that kind of played a really important role in the kind of transmission of energy prices to the kind of broader economy because of how widely used electricity is. So that's another sense in which the kind of transition to renewables will help, is because it will sort of lessen the sort of impact that fossil fuels has on electricity prices as well.
Yeah, interesting. James, from your discussions with business leaders, is there a perception that, the transition is going to be smooth, or are they pretty expected that it's going to be disruptive?
I don't get the impression that nobody expects it to be easy. And I think there is still a tangible sense of kind of mystery and confusion over exactly how it will affect them individually. I think people can see the tangible risks on the horizon. So, for example, in an economy like Malaysia, which the value of Malaysian exports is worth 70% of GDP, it's very heavily dependent on overseas demand. They can see the threats coming through the pipeline, just very close now on the horizon, from things like the carbon border adjustment mechanism in Europe, from the kind of financial disclosure standards that are happening all over the world, but especially driven by Western markets, which will start to very quickly affect their bottom line, I guess, and in terms of the value of their overseas markets. And I think what's been interesting is that this has kind of almost led to a dynamic in which it's the businesses who are on the front foot forcing change in policy domestically to kind of support that transition, rather than what would ordinarily be the case, which is that regulations being imposed by a national government upon firms who are objecting to it. Actually, there's this kind of switch around in dynamic where these kind of global forces, the extraterritorial policies that have been taken in Brussels, are actually kind of driving businesses to change their activities all around the world. So I think I've just realised that doesn't really answer your question whether it's smooth or disruptive, but I think it gives a sense of what's been really interesting about that is how this kind of policy measure in Europe has actually brought perspective and focus on getting on with these kinds of changes. And I think that does add a bit of clarity to the picture. I'm not sure clarity is the same as smoothness, but I hope that's useful anyway.
Yeah, thank you, James. I think that's a bit of a call to action to end on, really. We as professionals and our listeners as business leaders, professionals, and all of us as individuals, really, we have a closing window to support change and also to grasp the opportunities presented in the green economy. So thank you, James and Sean, for joining us. It's been a really interesting discussion. But before I let you go, I'm going to have to subject you to the inaugural edition of the Greenomics Gamble. So I have 2 energy transition related fun facts and 1 lie. I'm going to give them to you and you have to pick the lie. So good luck. The first is that the country with the highest volume of renewable generation capacity has more than 3 times the second place country. The second is that the first solar panel was installed in New York in 1921. And the third is that the world's largest 3 emitters contribute 15 times the emissions of the bottom 100. What do we think? Just a lie.
Oh boy, I think I'm going to try and see through your final fact and expose that it's even bigger, the disparity between the top 15. Was that what you said? Sean?
I agree. That was mine as well.
All right. Well, actually, that is not the lie. The lie, I know. But the lie was the second one, which is that the first solar panel was installed in New York in 1883, which is pretty wild.
Wow.
Yeah. Not the most efficient. I think it was about 1% efficiency, but still pretty ahead of its time. But yeah, on that third one, it is 15 times the emissions of the bottom 100, which is still shocking, but perhaps an indictment on the inequality of energy use that you thought it was higher. Well, that's it for today. So thank you again for joining us, Sean and James. It's been really good to have you on the show. And thank you all for listening. Next episode, we'll be discussing the ins and outs of upcoming nature-related financial regulation and its impacts on businesses. So look forward to seeing you then.